This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, episode 640, recorded on July 15th, 2020. It's tax day, Americans. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. Joining me today from Madison, New Jersey, Brienne Barker.
Hi, it's great to be here. Looks like it's a sunny 78 degrees outside, though I haven't been anywhere other than Zoom today, so I couldn't tell you for sure.
A new destination, Zoom. Also joining us from southeastern Michigan, Kathy Spindler.
Hi, everybody. Here it's 82 Fahrenheit, which means it's 28 Celsius.
Nice. Right on the dot.
Yep.
Very good. And from Austin, Texas, Rich Condit.
Hi, everybody. We got 84 degrees here, headed for 101 today on the tail end of a streak of 100-degree days. And I feel compelled to report that the 7-day moving average for hospital admissions in the Austin metropolitan statistical area has been pretty much level for the past 5 days or so at around 70 cases today, down from a peak of 75, but of course, 7 times what it was as baseline. So I would say cautiously that we have arrested what was a surge locally, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we hang on there.
Nothing like wearing face masks, you know?
Nothing like wearing face masks. I would also say that at this point in time, our hospital capacity is not saturated in our area. As I reported last time, they're on a contingency basis readying the convention center for overflow. It should be ready by the 20th, 5 days from now, and they're hoping they don't have to use it. We'll just have to see.
Our guest today is from the Harvard School of Public Health, Michael Mina. Welcome back.
Well, thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here, and in line with everyone else's weather updates, it's a balmy 70 degrees inside of my house. I haven't been outside.
Are you in Boston or outside of Boston?
I'm just in Boston. Yep.
Okay. Well, Michael, you were last with us on Immune in November of last year, when things were very different. So
they were very different, that's for sure.
For people who want to learn more about Michael's training, you can go listen to that episode number 26. I want to talk about 2 preprints you have out today about testing, group testing and rapid versus not so rapid testing. But I want to first just find out, we talked about your work on measles. How did you make this transition to SARS-CoV-2? When did you do that and why?
Oh, well, I mean, the whole world has done that in some way. But for me, it was back in January. So besides measles, I'm also in the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics with Mark Lipsitch and Caroline Buckey and others. And so SARS-CoV-2 came onto our radar back in December and January, really, as it was emerging in China. And my other hat outside of research is wearing, the other hat I wear is in clinical pathology and lab medicine, where I head up molecular virology diagnostics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And so back in January, I recall, seeing the writing on the wall from China, and as this virus was spreading out of Wuhan pretty rapidly, I went to the hospital and said, we really need to get us a COVID test up and running here. This was before the CDC initialized the public health emergency and the EUA was put into place. And so at that point in time, we started thinking we'd develop a lab-developed test for this virus. And pretty much since then, my life has been equal parts math modeling surrounding the virus and its transmission and the immunological parameters of it, and developing diagnostics and helping set up very high throughput laboratories for clinical use, at least in New England at the Broad Institute and some other places.
I notice you've been pretty critical on social media of the federal approach. I wonder what you think of today's announcement that the White House wants to cut CDC out from the data stream from hospitals. What do you think about that?
I am out of words. I mean, it's unfathomable. It's just this entire pandemic from the U.S. centric perspective has just been defined by poor decision making and poor leadership, and taking away power where it should be placed in terms of appropriate responses, and replacing it with people who don't know what the hell they're doing. And this is just another level of that same approach to this pandemic, I think.
I was stunned, actually, when I saw it.
Yeah, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. There is no reasonable explanation for this, besides politics and whatever else is happening.
Yeah, I suppose if you want to manipulate the numbers to look good for you, that's what you do. You control the flow, right? It's crazy. Yeah. Totally crazy. All right. So let's talk about the two preprints you have. They're still preprints, I think, right? They're not yet published?
They are preprints at this step. Yep.
Okay. First one, test sensitivity is secondary to frequency and turnaround time for COVID-19 surveillance. This is actually, for me, really interesting because it touches on a lot of things we were talking about. So give us the backstory here.
Yeah, so the backstory really comes from the laboratory side of things, and trying to figure out how to get more people tested. Mm-hmm. I think that testing it can be useful if done appropriately. It could, I think, really beat this virus down pretty quickly if we had enough tests. But of course, we don't have enough tests. We centralize our testing. We don't have it distributed in a way that actually is able to load balance across the country. And so where this leads us is to this point where we have some very, very powerful tests like PCR, but we are not using those tests adequately enough to be able to actually use it as a tool to screen the whole population. So that's one just piece of that sentiment. And then there's this New York NYU study that came out talking about the Abbott ID Now test. I don't know if you guys covered that when it came out, and it was pretty negative towards the test. And said, the Abbott ID Now is only picking up 50%. Its sensitivity is 50% or something poor like that.
Is that a regular RT-PCR test?
Oh, sorry. So it's essentially an RT-PCR. It's actually an isothermal amplification that it does, and it's got a nicking mechanism. So it's a little bit different, but it's a molecular test.
Okay.
And so this is the one that's you swab. You put the swab directly into the test, and 10 minutes later you have a result. Not surprisingly, Trump was using it, and the White House was using it. I think it actually added this whole element of politics to the evaluation of the ID Now. Once it became public that the Trump administration was using this particular test in the White House, there was a flurry of science that was saying that it wasn't a good test. I mean, it's really an interesting piece of information there. And I think it kind of needs to be, these studies have to be looked at a little bit through that light, because even scientists are political. And I think, unfortunately, it was politicized. But in any case, the ID Now instrument is really what led to this research. And the reason is that the studies that came out and said it's only 50% sensitive, if you actually go and read the preprint, which unfortunately the CT values, that's the inverse of the viral load. The CT values were in the preprint, but then they took the CT values from the samples that were processed in that study out of the published manuscript for who knows why, because I thought they were very useful. But if you go back to the preprint and you say, what were the samples that were actually missed in that study? It wasn't a loss of sensitivity of 50%. If you look at it through the right lens, almost all of the samples that were missed were at CT values that were skirting the edge of the limit of detection on a real-time PCR instrument. So if you're missing CT values of 39, in my perspective, who cares? It's really not that important. And that only gets magnified. And I'm coming back to the paper in a moment. That gets magnified if you look at the viral kinetics of how this virus grows. So a lot of people are saying, well, we need the really sensitive tests to be able to detect people early on in their infection. But almost all of the time that people spend with this virus near the limit of detection of PCR is on the tail end of their infection. This is a virus that once it hits PCR positivity levels, it's growing well in its exponential phase, and it's probably a matter of hours, not days, before it passes the threshold to be detected on some of these slightly lower sensitivity assays. And then it will sort of persist for weeks, potentially, or months even in some people at very low RNA levels. So it's after people are well beyond their transmissible period that we're actually seeing the loss in sensitivity of these assays. It's very rare that you actually detect somebody with a CT value of 39 in that window on their way up, because they're only sitting there for a few hours before they get down to a 33. So that's what led to that paper, which was saying, how important is it to catch people early on? And do we care if we're catching people after they're already past their point of transmission? And it turns out it really doesn't matter. There's almost no difference between, you could have an analytical sensitivity of the assay that's 2 or 3 orders of magnitude worse. But the point is the virus just blows through those levels of RNA. Once it hits PCR positive, once you're able to detect it with the gold standard assay, it's fully into deterministic exponential growth. And then it's just a matter of time before it gets to, it's not 1,000 viral copies per mil. It gets to 100,000 copies per mil. And then it's not even transmitting probably until it's at 1 million, 1 billion, or 1 trillion. And so should we really care if we can detect it at 10? I think that we've kind of lost our minds in terms of this real focus on analytical sensitivity. And in the process, we have created this whole ecosystem where we're so focused on high-end, expensive tests that we're not testing anyone, because we're trying to use clinical grade tests. And if you look at what the CDC's most recent announcement, maybe it was last week, 9 out of 10 people go undiagnosed with this virus today in the US. I would say that of those 1 out of 10 that do get diagnosed, almost all of them are getting diagnosed through surveillance after they've been infectious, because their CT values, we've seen the average CT value kind of creep up to 35 or so. So that means they're almost all at the tail end. So what that tells me is if we take a step back and we look at this virus and our testing program in the States, we're using a very sensitive test, but our sensitivity to detect infections is probably below 5%, across the US right now. The CDC says it's 10. And if we actually say detecting transmissible infections, we're woefully underutilizing testing. So if we know that the virus transmits once people are above, say, 100,000 or 1 million copies per mil, then maybe we only need a really crappy test if we can use it, if it's cheap enough to use it very frequently. Then it doesn't detect less than 5% of people when they're transmitting. Maybe it detects 85% of people when they're transmitting. And that's a huge win over what we have right now. So
do we actually know what the virus load is that is required for transmissibility?
Well, we can look at culture of how well we can culture the virus. And of course, there are some things, it's not a perfect indicator, but we know that once the virus gets below around 100,000 copies per mil, and some studies even say below 10 million, it's no longer culturable. And in some ways, that's not too surprising because it's a virus that throws off huge amounts of subgenomic RNA, which is detectable by the PCR instrument. So when we're below 100,000 RNA copies per mil, we might be more at like 1,000 viable viruses per mil, which is a pretty low amount to expect that to transmit to somebody else. It would be really pretty difficult at that level. So I would say that the culture positivity is a pretty good indicator.
In using a less sensitive test, it seems to me that you narrow the window in time where a given individual would test positive. But I guess what you're saying is that, in a way, that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think
because you don't care about the flanks of time.
That's exactly. We don't care about the flanks. We're not picking people up during their incubation period anyway. So we're picking them up, right before they become transmissible with PCR. And then again, it's only hours before the poorer tests become positive. And where I think this could really, I actually do believe that where we have too sensitive a test, because we're essentially taking all of the contact tracing that we're doing right now. Nobody's talking about it because we don't report out the CT values. But if you look at the average CT values of our surveillance programs, they're up at like the mid 30s, which to me, if you look at the kinetics of this curve, by the time people are in the mid 30s, they're probably a week out from having been transmissible. And, on average. So
you're wasting your time contact tracing them.
Right. Exactly. So in Massachusetts, the suggestion for contact tracing is to take people from the point that they were positive, sampled, and ask them to think back 2 days. So we're essentially taking people who might be 2 weeks post-transmissibility, and we're spending huge dollars to go and contact trace people they were with over the last 2 days. It's completely ridiculous. And it's because of how we're using these super sensitive viral tests. They were never tests designed for detection of transmissible virus. These are tests designed for any virus, which in a clinical setting, if you have somebody coming to you who's so sick that they are showing up at the doctor's office, then sure, we never had to worry about CT values or anything because the pre-test probability is so high already. They say, okay, this person looks like they have flu, they smell like they have flu, they feel like they have flu, and then they have flu positivity on a PCR, they have flu. But we wouldn't take a molecular flu test and use it for just broad surveillance of the population. It would be a bad idea.
So you've mentioned CT values that are in the mid 30s and say that that's probably where people are sort of past transmissibility. What sort of might be the range where people actually are transmitting? Just for listeners who are not used to thinking about CTs.
Yeah, and how does that translate into genome copies?
Yeah, so the CT value, around 3.3 CT values is an order of magnitude. So if you have a CT value of 40 and then you kind of move down to a CT value of 37, that's an increase, a tenfold increase. And from 37 to 33 or so, it's 3.3, so it's not exactly 3. That's another tenfold change up. And so people who are transmitting probably have CT values that are below 30, and the vast majority probably have them below 25 or so. And so what we see is that people who are really sick, they'll have CT values as low as 12 or so. So I've even seen one that was 8, which was astounding. And that suggests probably around 1 trillion copies or something like that. But most people will have CT values when they're transmitting somewhere in the upper teens to lower 20s. And so going from 22 to 35, that's many orders of magnitude change. And so, that's something like a four orders of magnitude change. So most people, once you're going from the point of which you're transmitting to then dropping your viral counts by 99.99%, you're probably no longer transmitting too much at that point. But the PCR still does a great job at detecting it, for better or worse.
So what is the actual window of transmission? How many days are we in an uncomplicated patient?
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying, the studies are the research is still, the jury's still out there. But I would say if we're thinking about this from the perspective of these within host kinetics, which I haven't seen any good studies really doing too much to directly translate it into very good population transmission data. But I would say the window is probably on the order of a week that people are transmitting. And it's probably, my guess, if you think about how high this virus can grow, people can't sustain a virus growing in the respiratory tract once it's at 1 billion copies per mil for very long. Pretty quickly it will blow through all of the cells in their body. And so essentially they have to start beating it down quickly. And my guess is actually the period of true transmission, I bet it's on the order of just a few days when people are most transmissible. And maybe if you're, your spouse or your partner, somebody who you're spending a lot of time with, maybe you can transmit to them, over a longer duration. But being out at a restaurant or something, I bet the majority of transmission is happening from people just over a short duration of time.
So when you get to the point where you can't breathe and you go to a hospital, you're probably not very transmissible at that point, right? So is that fair to say?
Well, that's taking the extreme. Those individuals could be in a slightly different category than the vast majority who are getting this. Because those people, if you're so sick that you're going to the hospital, then you might actually be, your body is just might not be able to beat the virus down. And so it might actually be getting out of control. So you might actually be somebody, or that individual showing up at the hospital could transmit longer.
But we're not worried. We can contain them, obviously, right? The in-hospital is not what the people who are outside who feel fine and they go to dinner, they're the ones we're worried about.
Yeah.
So
and that's what this paper is all about. It's saying, and then we had an op-ed, I don't know if you saw it, in the New York Times, calling for, it's kind of on the heels of that. It was with Larry Kotlikoff, who's an economist at BU, who's become very engaged in sort of this, trying to figure out solutions. But the whole idea there is to take what that paper showed, which is essentially that high frequency testing using a less sensitive test goes much further than low frequency testing using the best test in the world. And we pretty much found that if you test less than, every 2 weeks, you're not going to be able to contain pathogens. Yeah. At least, unless you have a more dynamical approach where you find a case and then you throw in more frequent testing. But what I would suggest is we have really cheap, low sensitivity, from a molecular perspective, low sensitivity tests that are $1, that people take every day. And so then it doesn't have to catch you in your incubation period. It doesn't have to catch you 20 days later. It just has to tell you the morning of that you have enough virus that you could be transmitting.
Do such tests exist, or will they?
They do, they do. So this is the other bit that really led to that. They do exist. And I've been advising a lot of companies on their reagents and their tests and the test characteristics that might be needed. And the most frustrating thing for me is that these tests exist, but they're all getting slammed, especially when they look at what happened with Abbott ID now, getting slammed for having a sensitivity that's a few CT values worse than PCR, which is, nothing. If you have a sensitivity that gets you to a CT value of 36, great. Like, that's amazing. But these companies are shaking in their boots saying, well, we can't go to the FDA. We can't try to market this test yet because its sensitivity is 3 orders of magnitude worse than PCR analytically on the molecular level. And so I've been saying, the FDA and the CDC and the NIH have to change their messaging. They have to say, look, there is actually a technology that a test could exist right now. I have some sitting in my office next to me. They're paper strips. They're just little pieces of cardboard printed with monoclonal antibodies that can pick up an antigen. It's essentially a lateral flow assay. It can be printed in the millions. And could be probably done by the federal government, funded by the federal government for, $1 a piece. And sure, they're not going to be nearly as sensitive as PCR, but if everyone could wake up every day and take it, these things could exist. But the way that the FDA is evaluating tests right now, they're saying they want it to be 80% as sensitive as a PCR. And, how you actually measure that is completely dependent anyway on which samples you're using. So one way to get around it is just to go and cherry pick your samples and take all high viral load samples, but that's not really kosher. So they do exist is the point, and it's just accelerating the process and telling them, look, you don't have to get this test. This test is so important right now and so valuable. Don't make it as a clinical grade test. Make it as a surveillance grade test.
Yeah.
Be okay with 3 or 4 orders of magnitude worse analytical sensitivity on the molecular scale to get 3 or 4 orders of magnitude better on the picking up people who are infectious scale.
Sounds like
go
ahead.
So does that mean that they exist, but are perhaps not actually things, people could get that are, out there to be bought?
That's exactly right. They're sitting in the research labs. They're sitting in some companies, like Sherlock, Mammoth Biosciences, E25 Bio, and a bunch of others. They exist, and these companies are all kind of producing their cheaper pregnancy test model kind of tests, but none of them are going to market anytime soon because they're saying, I can't speak for them, and so maybe they are, I don't know, but as far as I know, I haven't seen any real movement towards going to market. And in personal communications with a lot of researchers who are also developing these tests, a lot of them have said, it's not up to par yet. I can't, it's going to take me another 6 months. And not only is it going to delay it, but the final product is going to be using much higher grade reagents. So it's not going to be $1 a test. It's going to be $15 a test, which takes it out of the realm of possibility for doing every single day.
And 6 months from now, things may look totally different.
Yeah. Exactly. It could look totally different. And I don't know, I woke up today and I wrote to Larry, I texted Larry Kotlikoff, who I wrote that New York Times piece with, and I just said, we have to change the model. This is so crucial, so important right now that, the federal government has to take this out of the hands of the companies. They just need to do it. This is a simple technology. Get the NIH just to, contract with some major manufacturer and just start printing millions of these the same way we print trillions of dollars, and
I think there'd be a lot of schools and a lot of colleges that would be really interested in this.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to me, the short way to say it is, if the test isn't as good, but we do it every day and you get the results quicker, you're going to be way ahead in the long run. I mean, that's the other thing we haven't really touched on is the turnaround time, but the sensitivity, okay, maybe not perfect, but test every day, get the results quickly. And if you test wrong day one, on day two, you'll probably test positive.
That's exactly right. And on aggregate, you'll drive the R effective, of this virus way down below 1. I mean, I think if you were to take this and give everyone in Miami or Austin or wherever there are burgeoning outbreaks right now, give everyone a test or give 50% of the people a test, you'd probably drive R effective down overnight. If everyone tomorrow could wake up, test themselves, you'd immediately filter out tens of thousands of people potentially who have the virus in them that day. And the other consequence is you don't have to worry about contact tracing because everyone would be doing their own test every day. It just, it can be done. And
this is with a pinprick, right, for a little bit of blood.
No, this is with that's a different thing, which I could talk about is the serology bit. But no, this is actually just kind of spitting on a paper strip or taking a Q-tip and putting it into a little plastic tube of saline and dropping a paper strip in there.
I'm thinking about school kids. You get up in the morning and take the test. It tells you whether or not to go to school. That solves the whole problem.
Yep. And it doesn't need to be perfect. You have one kid who tests negative and, they actually go to school. Well, that kid, otherwise that kid's not going to get tested at all, so they'll find themselves positive the next day and they'll infect overall fewer people, and anyone that they infect will on average find that they have been infected and they'll stay home. So it very quickly compounds into a massive reduction of virus in the population very quickly.
But this idea that they're not accurate, you just said that if you catch them at or near their peak of virus production, the accuracy goes way up, right? Because
exactly.
it's just at the fringe that it's not very accurate, right?
That's exactly right. And that's what the FDA at the moment, that's the whole story behind this Abbott ID Now assay. It's like, we've focused so much on testing the accuracy based on the limit of detection of PCR. Why shouldn't I think that the accuracy of a test should be based on its ability to detect transmissible virus.
Sure.
That's what it should be, not just dead virions that have some residual RNA left in double-walled vesicles.
Yeah. I mean, this solves so many problems. Like Rich said, the school problem, it solves community problems, workforce problems. What can we do to get this to happen? I mean, our listeners are going to hear this, but I mean, why won't FDA listen to you guys?
Well, they might. After the New York Times article came out, we did get some people at the White House on the phone, and but I haven't heard any. I don't. I think that they're going to continue taking the same trajectory overall. And so what we heard was, we have programs set up to fund companies to produce their tests, and so I just think. It's just boggles my mind, the enormity of this problem. This is killing, enormous numbers of people every day. It's costing the country trillions, like literally trillions of dollars. This should just be part of the national emergency. Meanwhile, they're waiting for companies like Sherlock and E25 Bio, which between them have maybe 25 employees, to fix a problem that is of global importance and is bankrupting our country. Like, we should be putting, it's one thing to make vaccines, it's one thing to make therapeutics, but these are things that necessarily take time. We have to wait to see what the efficacy is. We have to, it's really hard to make a good therapeutic. A diagnostic test should be a no-brainer. Make a $1 test, get it to everyone, change the way we view these things, and that should be completely being plowed through by the federal government and put out there. We don't have to make 300 million of them overnight. We just have to focus them at the moment in places where the cases are worse. I mean, in Massachusetts, we can deal with the capacity of testing we have at the moment. And it's just astounding that we don't see a flurry of ambitious activity from the U.S. Army. This should just, I don't know who makes it, but take every manufacturing company that knows how to print paper, adapt their tools to print monoclonal antibodies onto those sheets, and just start slicing it up and shipping it out. It's as easy as that. And I mean, I'm simplifying it a bit, but
yeah. The other aspect of this that's important. So we have Daniel Griffin, a clinician, on every week, and he has this conundrum of patients are PCR positive for weeks, and they don't know when to send them home, when to send them back to the nursing home. But your discussion earlier of how past a certain CT, there's no infectious virus, I think that's essential for these clinicians to understand, right?
Oh, yeah. And that's why, a couple months ago, I published a paper which, the title was something like to best use the SARS-CoV-2 PCR test, interpret the CT value. And so I put that out there, and it was essentially a call for us to be reporting the CT values, but I get a lot of pushback. And I even wrote to the editor-in-chief of the journal that published that Abbott study. And I said, look, we shouldn't be judging the sensitivities of these tests based on this, because people are no longer infectious. And what I get, though, unfortunately, is laboratory physicians, by and large, not all, there's some really, thoughtful people who think about the kinetics of the virus within the host. But people say, hey, if the RNA is there, then the test should be able to detect it always. That should be the gold standard, and that's what we should be doing. And so I've gotten a lot of pushback about the use of CTs, because they do get variable out at those edges. And I say, if you're, who cares if you're getting a negative versus if it kind of is going back and forth between positive and negative once somebody's really far along, like, that's good information to know. We should be interpreting the CT values to know, is somebody still infectious? And we could couple it. The other option, though, is instead of measuring people, we should be taking a blood test for everyone. If somebody has a CT value of 35 and has a high IgG level or an IgM level already, let them go back to work. No need to keep these people home from work. If they are antibody positive, we know that a lot of people are just keeping the virus RNA around for a long time when they're not transmitting. So that would be a different check on it. You could say, if they're already antibody positive, then that almost by definition means they've been far out.
Is there an issue of, if you were to report CT values, of standardizing them from one lab to the next? How would you deal with that?
We would deal with it in the same way we deal with all laboratory values that come out of any laboratory, which is this is a question I get a lot, and we deal with this every day. We just make lab-specific 95% confidence intervals, and we always deal with different instruments. Every lab has different manufacturers for cholesterol, and that's why when you get a report from a lab, the normal range for a test result is always defined for that lab. Of course, if you look in a textbook, they'll say it should be this and that, and you can get standards also to help with this. The biggest variability, though, is really the swab. And so it's how, there would be a worst case scenario, I would say, or maybe not a worst case scenario, but if you get a bad, say somebody is infectious and you just get a really poor quality swab, and it comes back and it gives a CT value of 36, you wouldn't want to say, but really the person has trillions. I think the likelihood is low, because if they have trillions, it's very unlikely to pick up so little viral particles. But even so maybe the other option, that's why you would do the antibody test along with it, or you just do 2 tests 24 hours apart. If you get a CT value of 35 and then 35, that tells you 2 things. It tells you, one, that it's definitely not the case that first 35 was on the way up, because the next day you would have gotten 25. And if it's 35 and 35, that tells you that you're no longer even clearing the virus. It's probably just these dead particles just sitting there. So I think just the serial samples can go a really long way to help.
So
I think.
Go ahead, Rian.
I was just going to say, I think that this is one place where virologists in general need to do a lot to help people with communication, is thinking about whether virus is present versus whether RNA is present versus infectious. I feel like I'm still having some conversations with friends about whether they have to disinfect their groceries. And in the end, it's the same problem of, we can use these super sensitive tests to detect viral RNA, but how does that actually correlate with infectiousness?
Yeah. There was that initial paper, I don't know if you remember, it was off the heels of the Diamond Princess, and they went in and CDC, there was I forget if it was, I think it was put out in one of the CDC journals, in an EID or something, but essentially it showed PCR positivity 17 days since the last person was in one of the rooms. And so then there were all these headlines that said CDC reports that the virus lives on surfaces for 17 days, which is,
I remember.
I talk about it, like the analogy that I use a lot is, if you have a serial killer on the loose and you kill that, the cops go and they kill that serial killer out on the street when he's killing, so it's a bad guy. If you go and a year later go to that serial killer's grave and dig up and find a piece of hair and find the DNA in that hair, you don't have to worry about that serial killer killing more people. Like, it's just DNA, And,
Good point. But, we have been hung up on the fact that you have to check for infectious virus in a BSL-3 lab. But what I'm taking away is you don't, because after a certain point, there's not any infectious virus there.
That's right. I think there will be tricky, there will be ways that to potentially even use a single swab and look at the RNA in the right, using different tools to be able to say, is it actually replicating still or not? And I think that we can do other things like that, or just use the simple antigen test. If there's no antigen and there is RNA, you can be pretty sure that, there's no transmissible virus.
Yeah. So, all right, we have 5 minutes left. Now, the other story about group testing, now it seems to me if you can do a buck test a day, you don't even need group testing. But So under what, this is where you pool samples to try and overcome time and resource constraints, right?
That's right. Yeah, and in many ways, it's the same story. With group testing, there's some really fancy tricks you can do mathematically to use the CT values to actually take a group test, a pooled group of specimens that you test all at once, and on any given day, use it for public health to monitor the prevalence based on sort of the viral load that's in a given pool. But the real concern that a lot of people have is, well, if you pool too many samples, you're going to lose sensitivity. Mm-hmm. But it gets to the same exact point, which is if somebody is positive enough to be transmitting, then you could probably pool 10,000 samples together and you're still going to find the positive sample. If they have 1 trillion copies, then, I had one reviewer on that paper initially, clearly somebody not really thinking well, saying there's no way you can do even a 3-fold dilution and still be really confident in your results. And that's insane. You could dilute a PCR, a positive swab, 1,000 or 10,000 times and still find that virus. So there's a lot of potential for pooled testing, I think, and it's a way that we've been working with different countries in Africa that are pretty resource limited and ministries of health to try to help them work out, what would be good pooling strategies. And these are places, whole governments that, collectively have very limited ability to run a lot of PCR tests. And what we find is if your goal is to detect outbreaks, maybe pooling, it can be used from a public health perspective to measure large numbers of samples across a population and in different communities and be able to pinpoint, say, hey, this community has an outbreak that's just starting. We found, 2 pools of positive samples. You don't even necessarily need to know which exact sample was the culprit. You just need to know, okay, now let's divert our resources over to that community. Yeah. So it can be a really powerful tool for public health. And one of the interesting things that we showed in that preprint is that if you do a small enough pool, maybe 10 or 20 samples, and you put one sample in 2 or 3 different pools and the prevalence is low, then you don't even need to sort of deconvolute the pools. You can just know probabilistically which was the culprit sample based on if 3 out of 10 pools turn positive and there's only 1 sample that was in all 3, then you know that that's the positive sample. So there's a lot of promise for pooled testing.
So this, I'm a little confused about sort of the objective and practically how it's used. It sounds to me as if a primary objective really is, rather than identifying individuals, doing prevalence studies. But on a practical sense, if you have a positive pool, would you then, is the goal to go and retest those people or somehow deconvolute it to identify the individual as positive? And, relative to testing everybody, is that an efficient approach?
Yeah. So if prevalence is low and you are truly just monitoring a very large population, say you're a minister of health and you're in charge of knowing when coronavirus or any other virus is coming into your country, then maybe your interest at that level is going to be, let's take huge pools of samples and just know, do we need to be doing real robust outbreak control in a community? So at that level, you don't even need to deconvolute. You're giving the correct information to know, is prevalence increasing? Is there a case happening out in the northwest of the country? And then you throw a lot of individual PCRs over there. The other option, though, is certainly what we've been hearing more and more about Cornell doing pooled testing. We've been thinking about at Harvard and MIT. Can we do pooled testing on college campuses and for businesses? And at that point, we're higher resourced areas, so we could do our pooled testing just to be able to get the throughput we need. And if we find a positive test, then we just go back to the individual samples that made up that pool. Mm-hmm. So there's 2 ways to do it. you could do that. You could take that approach where you actually keep all the individual samples and you just take aliquots and you put them into a pool. That allows the laboratory, without going back to the individual, to deconvolute it. But there's another approach too, which I think is potentially very useful. And that's an approach that doesn't actually dilute the signal at all. If you take dry swabs straight out of somebody's nose and you collect 20 of those swabs and you put them all into 1 ml of saline, you're not actually diluting the signal. The saline can easily capture all of the virus that might come from all 20 of those. And so then the problem there is that then you've contaminated the primary specimen. So the benefit is you don't lose any signal at all. In fact, it might just boost signal for the lower ones. But you still have to then go back and reach out to those individuals and say, hey, all 20 of you were in a positive pool. Go back to your rooms for the day. A health worker will come by and get a new swab from you. So there's a trade-off.
So just to be clear, the pooling works only with the high sensitivity PCR assays that we mentioned, right?
No, I actually think you could probably pool, especially if you're using this technique of just putting all of the swabs. Let's say you take 20 swabs, you put them into 1 ml. Or even in the Abbott ID Now instrument, you could take 20 swabs and put them all into that one test.
And what frequency on a college campus would be useful for this pooled testing? Would it be once a week? Is that enough or not enough?
Well, there's different philosophies. So I think that we're kind of all taking sledgehammers to this, which on the one hand is good. If you really want to catch every single case, then you probably want to be testing daily or every 3 days, something like that. And that's to catch every case. But a lot of colleges, until these $1 paper strip tests come about, and even with pooled testing, a lot of colleges and businesses aren't going to be able to do that. So there's a very different philosophical approach to doing public health work, which is not treating it to find every case, but stopping every outbreak. And by that, I mean, you have surveillance setups where maybe you won't find the first case that leads to an outbreak. Maybe you won't even find the second. But by the time it becomes 4 cases, you detect it. If you're doing weekly or every 2-week testing, or even using antibody testing for this, which is much cheaper, so you can broaden it out to more people. And then what you're doing is you're keeping all of your real sort of heavy PCR resources over here. You're doing less frequent testing, and then the moment you detect an outbreak emerging, then you really you put all your eggs over towards dealing with that that one outbreak, and you kind of just keep playing that game rather than trying. And that, in some ways, is the more sane way to go about this. Stop every outbreak, not necessarily every single case. But it's scary for people right now to think like a public health person. Everyone wants to treat a public health issue like a clinical issue. And it's
right.
That's kind of where we're at right now.
Michael, could go on for another hour, but we'll let you go. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Learned so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Really
this
good.
is awesome.
Michael
Fun
Mina,
papers to
Harvard
read.
School of Public Health. Maybe in a couple of months we'll get you back and see where things are.
All right. Well, always a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you having me on, and I hope that people have. If any listeners want to help, push the FDA to make some of these changes we're talking about, people can feel free to get in touch with me. You can find my email on some paper online or something.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Take care.
Wow. I
Indeed.
am blown away.
That was awesome.
Me too.
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
some hope finally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If only,
That's liberating.
I mean,
I-
$1 a day, I would do that, right?
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
feel like I want to take everything that we just heard from him and send it to all of my elected officials and everyone at the FDA and everyone I can think of and tell them to listen and learn.
It solves
To
every
university
problem.
leaders. Yeah.
Yeah.
It solves every
exactly.
problem, the school problem, the people shedding for ages. It solves everything.
Heck, you might be able to open the bars. Okay. You got the bouncer giving you a test, right?
Mhm.
And if you pass
I
the test, you
don't-
can go to the bar.
Why don't they do this? Why does the administration, we've already got things going. I mean, this did the
Yeah,
his
forget the
This is the
administration.
answer.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and there were people that said, back when we were talking about Colby College's, testing 85,000 tests. And by the way, they have a very large endowment, so they are able to do that for their 1,900 students. But people were saying, who are you kidding? You can't possibly be doing that. Well, clearly we could if we had this kind of...
Actually, if you told people that this might mean that you could open the bars, they might go for it.
Yeah.
Well, the companies have to make it, right? Because that's the limitation. But I think even pool testing, I mean, I was always very critical, but if you read the preprint and you listen to what he said here and the ideas about, if you're a gangbusters shedding, they're going to pick it up in the pool. I think it makes perfect sense. So now if Cornell wants to do pools once a week, I think that's a good idea now. I really have been transformed by listening to that.
I have to say, too, what a mind. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have such smart people out there, okay? We have such resources. What a mind. I can't, it's incredible.
I've always really respected him for his measles papers, and now sort of seeing that mind translate across multiple topics is really cool.
Yeah.
Well, this says the bottom line here is you should encourage everyone in science. You shouldn't politicize it and make sides. That doesn't do anything. And, you've got the sense of that's happening, and it shouldn't be. If you want to save lives. Yeah,
there needs to be in the leadership for this, there needs to be a really big tent with people listening to all sorts of ideas so that there's a place for people like him to go and be heard. Okay. Yeah. And there are people who can understand what he's saying to listen to him.
Yeah. There's one, I want to make a quote from one of his papers. I don't remember which one it was, but he talks about being floridly positive, which I think is great because, you can pick up those people and that's the ones that matter. And he says, we propose that for inpatients whose symptoms have fully resolved and 2 tests over 24 hours apart are either negative or close to the CT cutoff, which is 34 or higher. They likely do not have meaningful or transmissible disease and thus do not need to be retested. This just solves the problem of a BSL-3 lab, right?
Right.
And I didn't think about this, but when you do a PCR, you're picking up everything in the infected cell. It's just not viral genomic DNA. You're picking up messenger RNAs, defective particles, all of which are not infectious. So that's why below a certain amount of RNA on the PCR, there's no transmission problem. It's just...
Yeah. I had reason to go back to listen to Susan Weiss's lecture, part of it where she was talking about the transcripts and where the PCR tests are. And one of the things that gets tested is at the end of the genome where the highest abundance of all the different nested messenger RNAs are. So you're going to pick that up.
Yeah, that's right.
Just from the messenger RNA.
That's right. So that solves the problem for me. I was always worried, why is there so much RNA? It's just messenger RNAs.
Vincent, we did and I don't know who else was on the show. We did a paper some time ago where there was a fairly large scale study done that correlated CT values or RNA copies with a infectivity assay. Okay, remember this? And they could find infectious virus only above a certain RNA copy number, and it was only about 25% of the people that they looked at. And so I was always wondering whether, in fact, that other 75% of people, whether the infectivity assay was really sufficiently accurate. But I forget what the population of people they assayed were, whether these were people who were symptomatic at some point. I think they were.
They were mildly symptomatic,
definitely had disease because they were positive. And yet 75% of them were below what is probably his cutoff. Now, I wonder if that doesn't have to do with when they were assayed, because probably all of these people were only assayed maybe once.
Yeah, and so maybe it was sort of after the virus had peaked.
It's amazing.
Something like that. I'd have to go back and look at that paper again.
So he said 2 to 3 days is your transmission window, probably.
Yeah.
No more than
exactly.
7 days. That's amazing.
Right.
So,
Right. So
someone in a bar who's transmitting, they feel fine. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in the bar, right?
yeah, that's the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that all the other studies say that your peak of virus load, you probably peak in terms of virus load before you have any symptoms.
Yep.
Okay.
That's when you're floridly positive.
Floridly positive. Yeah.
And if you were testing every day, you'd be caught. Yeah.
I feel
swear to God,
floridly
if you tell-
positive about this, the prospects of this working.
I wish, if we can get FDA on board, and we have an email here from someone that there's already a company with a rapid antigen test. I think we need more of that, right? Wow, that was great.
I'd sure stock up. Like he says, get up every morning and take the test.
Yeah.
I mean, schools. I mean, this is the solution.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kids would figure out how to make it positive,
The new Ferris Bueller.
Well, except that the penalty for being positive is you're quarantined for 2 weeks or something.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't.
I
mind.
know. My grandchildren want to go to school. They're sick of this being stuck at home stuff.
Yeah. All right. Wow, that was good.
Wow, indeed. Good call, Vincent. Thanks.
I'd seen some of these papers in his commentaries, his op-ed in the Times, and it sounded good. Good. So we had a few emails I was going to ask him, but I think we can give answers to these now.
Before we get going on that, I just wanted to make a comment about the listener who wrote in about the show that I was on last week with Rich, and who was complaining about us perhaps bashing on China. And another perspective that I think is my perspective is that we weren't really trying to be negative or bash, as it were, on the citizens of China, but more on the leadership decisions that have been made. And by the same token, we have been similarly negative about leadership decisions here and in some other countries. I mean, I think at one point, we weren't sure where the Sweden situation was, but so I like I say, I just think of it as not so much being bigoted, I think was the word. I never even went and read that person's letter, but just that we're frustrated when leadership decisions are made that we think are not wise. And in this case, it was this decision to give the vaccine before it had been widely tested, but to give it to the military. And that just to us didn't seem like a good decision.
Yeah, that's the basis of our objection. It wasn't bigotry. If we were bigots, we would say a lot worse.
There was also a lot of that conversation. We had, fragmented information from
admittedly,
secondary or tertiary sources. A lot of that conversation was just trying to understand what's going on and trying to put it in context.
I mean, you have to understand that this is a conversation. We're chatting.
Right.
We're not going to peer review everything we say, even though you would like. Some people have asked us to peer review the letters, right? No.
This stuff that's going on with, I hope the public learns something from science by paying some attention to the pandemic and as reflected in what we do, because this is a moving target. We've been in new territory the whole time. And we've all been, I don't want to say wrong, okay?
We made mistakes.
But wrong, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
based on the information that we had. Yeah,
based on the information that we had, when this started off, I thought wearing masks was ridiculous, okay? And now I carry one around with me all the time. So I'm always prepared. I carry it like my wallet.
Yeah.
Admitting you've made a mistake is a key. And someone wrote in last time, they said that gives you respect. And I wish people in charge in this country would admit they've made a mistake. Like, the CDC and even Tony Fauci said in February, you don't have to wear masks. I wish they would say now we made a mistake and now you should, because when they don't say that, people suspect, like, what are you doing? Please admit your mistake. I screwed up.
It seems to me that in general in politics, it's people don't want to say I was wrong or admit a mistake, and that's just wrong-headedness. The way you move forward is to admit your mistakes and learn from them.
Unfortunately, there are some scientists who do not like to admit their mistakes because science is very competitive, and especially funding and publishing. But I think that's wrong. I think
right. Really, the way science works is that we all sort of build on each other's new knowledge. And
I mean, if you don't admit your mistakes, then it's up to other people to figure out what happened, and that just takes more time. And it would be better if you did it. But
I'm reminded of this. I think I talked about this even recently ago. Neil deGrasse Tyson visit on Wait, Don't Tell Me. And I think, Kathy, you riffed on this at some point or another, where in Wait, Don't Tell Me, they got, little silly quizzes that they give people, and they like 5 questions or something, and they asked Neil deGrasse Tyson these, and he got them all wrong. and at the end of the show, the host says, gee, I'm really sorry. You got all those questions wrong. He says, what do you mean? He says, I learned 5 new things.
That's right.
If I'd have got them all right, I wouldn't have learned anything.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So let's answer some email. Louisa is a pediatrician working for the Indian Health Service and helping reservation schools with protocols for the fall. Your podcast from 4th of July discussed there are many schools that are testing students and staff weekly. So she wants to know, are they doing nasopharyngeal swabs, mid-turbinate? Our state health department has only validated nasopharyngeal swabs. And we do have ample testing supplies and are testing our IHS staff every 2 weeks. But I can say now from personal experience that testing young kids weekly if using NP swab is going to be a challenge in and of itself, given the invasiveness and discomfort of the test. I would love more information on this. I'm trying to push our clinic to just do anterior nary sampling, but we have too many NP brushes, and our leadership is concerned that the wrong brush will increase false negatives. So Daniel Griffin, so I think you're right. Don't do the NP swab. The kids are going to hate it. And you don't need to. You can do a nary swab. That's what Daniel Griffin's health organization looked at. It was just as accurate. And I think saliva. I mean, we've had a few papers on saliva, and Michael just said you can use saliva as well. So,
and in one of his papers that we read, it also mentioned using these just Naries type testing by the individual in their own home.
Now, part of Louisa's trouble is that they have all these NP brushes, and they don't want to use it for something else. It may not work. But I would say validate either a saliva or a Naries swab. Don't worry about your brushes. Sell them. Somebody will buy them from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a significant part of this problem, as we've discussed before, is what is validated. Okay, and I know here in the FDA, if you want something validated, you got to go through a whole lot of rigmarole to get a particular. If you're going to change from NP swabs to saliva or something like that, you got to validate a whole new protocol, and that's a pretty rigorous process. And right now, people feel like they just don't have the time for it. But that needs to be streamlined as well. Somehow, you got to be able to get around that.
Well, and she says that her last line, our leadership is concerned the wrong brush will increase false negatives. Well, we just talked with Michael Mina, and he said, basically, if you're testing every day and you get a false negative one day, the next day, you're not likely to get a false negative because the virus is probably going up. And, the chances of getting 2 false negatives are even smaller. So,
Rich, can you take Fred's?
Fred? I'm seeing Peter.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Peter. Hello, Team TWiV. I'm writing from Truro, Massachusetts, where it's 29°C and gorgeous. I'm overlooking the spot where the Pilgrims landed 400 years ago, months before crossing Cape Cod Bay to Plymouth. Love you folks and very much appreciate your honest talk and occasional Vincent rant, what I call, this is good. Rack and yelling.
I like it.
Great. I never thought of that.
That's very good. Rack and yelling. It must be a show title.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to copy that, make it a show title. I'm a doctor and a scientist, just the wrong kind, a political science PhD. Reminds me of my son saying that any discipline that feels like it has to have science in its name is not actually a science. In TWiV 638, and he's a computer scientist, by the way, in TWiV 638, while talking with Viviana Simon, you asked about a faster COVID-19 test, and she agreed that one might be coming. Are you aware of that? Are you aware that Quidel has an FDA-approved Sophia 2 SARS antigen FIA test that gives results in 15 minutes? And he gives a link to that. Local care, urgent care locations are offering the test. What are your thoughts? Well, I think we've covered that. Our thoughts are, yeah, go for it. One other quick question. I'm a data analyst, and a few bits of data have been bothering me. There's a good news, bad news story I recently heard on NPR. They reported that near Menakami, the chair of Health Policy and Management at Indiana University Fairbanks College of Public Health, was reporting a survey study showing that roughly 3% of Indiana's population had been infected, about half without symptoms, and that the lethality rate of infection was 0.6%. Other studies in New York City have suggested lethality of as little as 0.5%, which is better than the original estimates of 1% or more. Here's the bad news. As of today, the U.S. has 133,000 deaths, and there was much concern about the number of cases crossing 3 million. But if the lethality is between 0.5 and 0.6%, and we have 133,000 deaths, that suggests that between 21 and 26 million people have been infected. And that's as of several weeks ago, because it takes time to die. Why aren't more doctors and scientists helping the media understand that the infection is much more widespread than 3 million cases would suggest, as if 3 million cases wasn't bad enough? Thanks for all you do, Peter. Well, I completely agree with his numbers. These are the kind of numbers that I was toying with weeks ago when I wrote that blog that you kindly posted for me, Vincent. I think the infection fatality rate is the number that we would like to have and be looking at. And if you have a pretty good grip on the infection fatality rate and you know what the fatalities are, you can back calculate and get a theoretical sort of infection rate or what should be a seropositivity in the population. And it comes out to be a bigger number than the other estimates give us. The flip side of that is that if the infection fatality rate is really as high as 0.5%, and if you have to reach something like 70 or 80% of the population infected to reach herd immunity, then you're talking 500,000 or 1 million deaths. Okay, so but I think your reasoning is exactly right, and I would like to see that sort of thinking more widespread. So everybody, listen to TWiV, okay, and make that your resource.
This test that he mentions is it's only for healthcare providers. You can't buy it, but it is FDA approved. It uses nasal swab or nasopharyngeal swab, and 15-minute. It's a lateral flow assay, basically, and I don't know how much it costs, but this is great. This is just what Michael was talking about. But
everything that I've seen says that spit is every bit as good as nasal swabs or nasopharyngeal swabs. So a lateral flow test that you can spit on, that would be ideal.
It's just as Viviana said, people have validated the nasopharyngeal swab. They don't want to revalidate with spit, but it seems to me you should. I know it's hard, but it's so much easier.
Well, it's kind of what Michael was talking about. You need to get some sort of, past some sort of threshold of acceptance of something, get enough people to get on board, and then you could ramp this kind of stuff up pretty fast.
Kathy, can you take the next one?
Sure. Fred writes, Dear TWiV crew, thanks for your hard work communicating the state of science of viruses, the kind that make you sick, to the world in general. I greatly appreciate the podcast, and I listen at 1.5x speed up on my nightly walks. One question I have about testing: the PCR test has a high sensitivity, and thus a high positive predictive value. Maybe I've learned something, but not high specificity. So there is a negative predictive value. PCR is just not well suited for saying who is not infected because of the false negatives. I found a Johns Hopkins paper which seems to say there are more than 50% false negatives in the first 4 days of infection, and in the 20 to 30% range at system onset. Even with a negative PCR test, Bayes would argue for additional evidence before declaring someone not infected. I think antibody tests may miss a significant fraction of people who are infected too. So we can't use an antibody screen and then do a PCR on antibody positives, even if antibodies appear early enough in the course of infection to be useful. T-cell reactivity seems to be not a good choice either, even if we could do it rapidly, because the Singapore paper had T-cell reactivity in people with no known exposure to SARS-CoV-1 or SARS-CoV-2. Given all the above, with the high false negative of the PCR, how does a testing program test often enough to find infectious cases early? Does weekly testing leave a window for a super spreader to kick off a new round of whack-a-mole? What is the optimal testing protocol for Tetris? And he sends the JH reference. Is that Johns Hopkins? It's not mentioned. Anyway, he sends a reference to a paper.
He said a Hopkins paper.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Vincent, these emails are incredible.
Yeah, they're great, aren't they?
Yeah. So a testing program needs to test probably more often than weekly. And the data that's in one of Michael Mina's paper clearly shows that. It's the preprint that's already formatted. So maybe he called it a preprint, but anyway, it's the Larry Moore is the first author and Roy Parker is the last author.
That's the first one we talked about, right?
Yeah. And it definitely shows that if you wait a week, it could be too long. So I think this idea of frequent testing, even if it's not totally perfect and you have some false negatives, if you test enough times, the false negatives are going to be minimized.
Yeah, because if you get a negative, then they're probably not high enough to shed, to be transmitting, right? That was his bottom line. And in this test, this Hopkins paper, which says 50% false negatives in the first 4 days, yeah, that's because the titers are too low. It doesn't matter. Right. And Michael would say they're not transmitting, so who cares?
Right.
Right. But test on day 5 or 6 or 7 or
so that's why
5 and 6 and 7. Yeah.
That's why if you can test daily, then you can get a handle on this. It makes perfect sense, right?
Vincent, did these emails all come? Are you filtering these? like, is this some sort of supernatural coincidence that's pushing us to a new paradigm?
Well, I picked these for Michael. I thought we'd have time for him to answer them. They're mostly all in the last, week or so.
Okay.
But I didn't realize he would basically answer all of them.
Yeah.
Right. Brianne.
Sure. Ryan writes, hello from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It is 302.15 degrees Kelvin and partly sunny here on July 11th, 2020. I'm a longtime TWiV, TWIM, and TWIP listener, but this is my first time writing. These shows offer amazing insights and have been the background accompaniment for many projects around our small farm. I wonder if you could discuss the merits of pooled RT-PCR tests for COVID. I've run many RT-PCR assays for genes and microbes, but never on pooled samples. Should it be considered part of the school and college reopening strategy? All the best, Ryan. I think that we heard from Michael Mina, and while I also was sort of questioning pooled sampling before looking at his preprint and before hearing from him, I would say now absolutely that pooled sampling should be considered for part of school and college reopening.
Yeah, and take a look at his preprint. We'll put a link in. I mean, there was obviously more there than we could talk about with him, but I have to say, I was very critical of pooling. I was wrong. It's very compelling. They've done modeling and some experiments in that paper to show the power of pooling. And for schools and colleges, you can either do that or daily. Well, if we had a daily dollar antigen test, you could do that, but we don't have it yet, right?
Right, but pools would let you do your other testing more frequently.
Yeah, and what he said is really important. Do it cleverly. So if you take people and have them in multiple pools, then you could tell who's positive more easily, right? It's brilliant. So I have to say that I was asked this week to be on my school board's advisory committee for figuring out how to open schools in the fall, which I'm happy to do. I've never been asked to do any of that sort of thing. But I'm going to say, I have to do pool testing. You have to work with someone who knows how to do it, right? So you just can't throw samples together. But
I want to reiterate that the pool testing works when the incidence is relatively low, because to be economical, because once the incidence is really high, you do the pool testing, and then you've got to test everybody. You're testing every pool. All the samples from every pool.
As he said, you can use it to detect when you're having an outbreak, right? And then if you see the numbers rise, then you go to single testing. Yeah, very, very important. Okay, so we have two emails now on the Novavax. No, actually, one is on the China story and one is on Novavax. Okay. So John Cohen writes, John is a science writer over at Science. I've read many of his articles over the years. I think all of you know who he is as well, right? I much enjoy TWiV. A couple of things in your last episode could use some clarification. So let me just say that it's a lovely way of saying, you guys screwed up, let me fix it.
or maybe there's some additional information that you didn't have, and let me provide that for you. I think
that's fine. I don't mind being corrected, but if you say you guys screwed up, no, I'm gonna raise my hackles, right? Because I'm just human. I'm sorry.
There will be some rack and yelling.
There will be rack. I was thinking the same thing, Brian.
I have to say, I felt badly about yelling last time because I don't want to make a spectacle, but I get worked up about things. All right, the CanSino approval for the military basically allows the company to use military regulations rather than the regulatory approval process. I have been told by a Chinese health official that no one in the military has been vaccinated as part of that allowance, but they wanted this provision in case of ship or base outbreaks. The U.S. military has a long history of pushing for exemptions to U.S. FDA regs. Our system differs from China, but to my non-lawyer mind, it seems to me a matter of degree, not kind. And he gives 3 links to articles that talk about that, and I was unaware of that, so that's important, okay? So we can do the same thing.
If you dig into Wikipedia, you can find a lot of information on the anthrax vaccine, which has gone there's been a hassle over this in the military for a long time, and it sort of exemplifies what the problems, the tug of war between the FDA and the military is on one of these issues.
Okay, as for warp speed and transparency, the 5 candidates that David Tuller mentioned, I actually think he means Rich Condit here, because David Tuller was not on the show.
Right, could be, yeah. It's okay.
Were not disclosed by Warp Speed. This was reported by the New York Times, according to senior administration officials. There is no information about how Warp Speed has chosen candidates. I have covered this at some length, and he links to his really nice article about this. How are these choices being made?
Opaque is in the title of the article.
Yes.
Or in the link, anyway. Yeah.
Let's see. Is it in the article? The title is Operation Warp Speed's Opaque Choices of COVID-19 Vaccines Draw Senate Scrutiny. And then he wrote a subsequent email. Since I sent this note, Warp Speed held a press teleconference and named 4 vaccines that are explicitly part of the project. Interestingly, Warp Speed likes to crow about its transparency, but one of the 2 senior administration officials on the call insisted that comments could only be attributed to a senior administration official. The other one, Janet Woodcock, was on the record. The 4 candidates they've selected are, no surprise, Moderna, J&J, Oxford, AstraZeneca, and Novavax.
And so to detail those, Moderna is an mRNA vaccine. And just yesterday, there was a JAMA article published with the complete phase 1 trial results from that. And you can look at that, or you can look on Moderna's website. They have a press release that's actually quite good, and it even includes data that summarizes all that. J&J is an AD26 vectored vaccine. The Oxford AstraZeneca is the chimp adeno-vectored vaccine, and Novavax, which we'll talk more about below, is a protein subunit vaccine.
Yeah, I think we'll talk about the Moderna phase 1 on Friday, because I didn't have a chance to look.
So, in fact, that selection of 4 is a nice spectrum of technologies. Mm-hmm. There's obviously some technologies missing, but it's a nice spectrum. Out of the earlier part of John's letter about the CanSino approval for the military, I was assuming from that they are going to vaccinate the military from the original articles on that. John leads me to believe that it's just approved for the military.
Yeah.
So that if they judge that their troops are in a situation where they might have a significant exposure, they could use it. It's not like, I don't know exactly what it is, but that sounds like what John's talking about. Okay. Yeah. Rather than just going through and vaccinating everybody, they're making it available.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well.
Okay. That makes sense. Rich, you're next.
Matt Freeman writes, I wanted to show you the paper that you were asking about when you were discussing the Novavax vaccine. They sure did get $1.6 billion last week on top of the $350 million from CEPI and $60 million from DoD. I was the one that did all the neutralizing antibody experiments and mouse experiments. Also below are the 2 other MERS vaccine papers I published with them using the same technology several years ago. I don't see the links here, but maybe you have them, Vincent.
So the Nature paper's under review. So I told Matt when it's accepted, we can have him on. He can talk about all this, and he agreed to do that.
Okay. The vaccine uses a double mutant of spike, where there is a furin site mutation and a mutation in the stalk, which locks the protein in the prefusion state. This likely keeps it in a realistic structure to the outside of the virus. They also use their insect cell system, where they express full-length spike in insect cells, extract the protein, and then form these little florets of 4 to 6 spikes stuck together at their C-termini transmembrane domain. These they call these nanoparticles. There are EMs of them on their website and in the MERS papers below. There is nothing extra added to make them nanoparticles, unlike what Rich was suspecting. They stick together at their transmembrane domain, and that's what forms the particles. Mixed with their adjuvant, they make a very nice multimeric antigen for the vaccines. The new SARS-2 paper is really nice, showing particle size and thermostability, nice mouse protection, newts in mice and baboons, great B and T cell responses, etc. Phase 1 trial almost ending soon with those data, Matt, coming out as soon as it's all done. Hoping this is a good vaccine that is safe and effective. Phase 2 and 3 trial sites are around the world. Fingers crossed. Data look good so far. Thanks, Matt. So it'll be good to have him on to talk about that. And what I get new out of this is that there is nothing added to the seed. At least I had from their videos and stuff, I had the basic technology right, that these things adhere, if you like, at their C-termini and form these star-looking structures that they call nanoparticles. I was thinking about this morning and wondering, so the transmembrane domains are going to be kind of hydrophobic, which would seem to me to promote their aggregation. I wonder if a lot of other people who try and make soluble spike don't just get rid of the transmembrane domain, because it creates an aggregation problem, and that seems like a pain in the butt. But it could be that that's a good thing. And it's almost like they're, in a way, sort of theoretically macromolecular micelles where you have a hydrophobic core and a hydrophilic exterior. Very, very interesting. And I can, from everything I know, which is not a whole hell of a lot about vaccines, I can see how that structure, the sort of multimeric nanoparticle structure, would be a potential advantage for a vaccine.
Yeah, mimicking the surface of the particle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Kathy.
Michael writes, Vincent et al. First, thank you for taking the time to produce TWiV. I find it a hugely valuable source of information that I can trust because you're all clearly so knowledgeable, but also so honest about the areas of scientific uncertainty that exist with respect to SARS-CoV-2. I'm curious whether the general support among the panelists for the reopening of school expressed in episode 635 would extend to preschools. I ask because I'm aware that some of the measures typically recommended to prevent transmission of the virus in a school setting may be difficult to implement in a preschool environment. For example, physical distancing for preschool children is developmentally problematic, given that children in this age group require touch and other physical interaction for proper emotional development. Moreover, with children of this age, any mask wearing requirement is likely to be honored primarily in the breach. Many preschools will also lack the separate rooms by which to divide the student body into smaller groups. Toys, which often end up in the mouth, are commonly shared across the entire group of students. Playground equipment is also shared and difficult to sanitize. And then, of course, there's the general matter of hygiene being an area where the students are commonly equal measures unpracticed and unconcerned. If your view is that preschool should reopen despite these challenges, what's the basis for that? And what would be the measures that you might advise in order to keep the students and staff safe? Would you require teachers to wear N95 masks? Would you limit the total number of hours per day that a student should be present in the classroom to reduce viral loading? Would you require frequent testing of students and staff? If so, where would you recommend the funding for that testing to arise? As is the case with most preschools, there's no endowment upon which to draw. Would you forbid the sharing of toys and activities? How would you recommend schools manage meal times? Would you require certain types of air filtration purification? Would you require eye coverings, given that children of this age are not particularly good at covering their cough? Of course, I realize that you might recommend all of the measures I've described above, but which are the measures without which you would not recommend reopening? So lots of thanks from Michael. I think frequent testing, as frequent as possible. And among all those other things, if N95 masks were widely available and not expensive, and people could be trained in how to fit them and wear them, maybe that would provide some additional measure of security for the teachers. But as soon as they take them off and use them as a chin hammock, touch the inside and outside, and then don't wash their hands, it's all over. Limiting the number of hours per day, I don't know if that's practical, again, without an endowment on which to draw.
I think
anything you could do to reduce the number of kids in a particular room and try to reduce density a little bit would probably be helpful.
Go ahead, Rich.
I don't. All I can say is that she's identified all the problems, and I don't have a magic solution for this. This idea of reopening schools, except for what we just talked about. If you could test each kid every day when they got up, that would do it. Okay, but I can't imagine preschool is all about interacting.
Yeah.
Right.
No. Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, you just. I would just not do it, I think, okay, if I thought that it proposed a significant risk. But the problem is, if you don't have preschool, that impacts on the kids' families. And what are they going to do? We're facing this problem right now, okay, because I think my daughter and her husband are going to have to go back to, I don't know. They're not going to have open schools for the first. They're going to do online for the first 3 weeks in the Austin Independent School District now. At least that's the determination for now. So how are we going to deal with that? Okay. A practical solution is for us.
You're going to take care of them.
But we're the ones at the high risk. Okay. So It's all backwards. It's all crazy. There's no good way to do this. All right. Except to test everybody every day, which we don't have the capability for now. So preschool just doesn't sound like a good idea at this time, but not having preschool, what's the bigger problem? Not having preschool or the impact it has on the families? I don't have an answer for that.
So preschool is a particularly thorny problem because of these issues. But, at one point in this country, we did not have preschool. When I was a kid, we did not go to preschool. I stayed home, but my mother's mother lived with us and she took care of us. So obviously that was easy. So I don't think preschool is essential. I think it plays more of a role for parents these days, right? So that's important. I understand that. I think where you're living will depend on whether your preschool should open or not. If you're in Austin right now, no. Maybe in the fall it's going to be different. But if you're in an area where there are a few cases being registered, which you should know because there should be testing enough to know that, then you could open. But I do agree that we have to have massive testing. I'm not even worried about the kids wearing face masks so much, but the teachers should. Maybe you should get rid of the toys just so that they're not putting them in their mouths. But
preschool without toys?
Yeah, I know. If you don't want to do that, then you should not have preschool. But we don't have the daily buck-a-day test, so you should write and make noise. Everybody should do this, and they should have been done already. They could have been developed in the past 3 months. So I think that's the way to do it.
In terms of the impact on families, I want to point out that if there are two working parents or if it's a single mom situation, but in general, more of the burden is going to fall on the women. I mean, I think there's some evidence already that, all these scientists staying at home wrote more grants and more of those came from men than from women. Papers being submitted, etc. So from the standpoint of equity in the workplace, it is a real thorny issue.
And I think that preschool has important effects for kids of different types of backgrounds, both in terms of getting access to some kinds of resources and getting access to kind of a diverse group of other preschool friends.
Now, the next one is going to help us here. Brianne, I think you're next.
Yes. Anon writes, hello from Rockford, Illinois, where it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 82% humidity. My wife is a school teacher and I have attached the official guidelines for return to school this fall. I thought you might find this informative. So it looks like this is specific for their district.
Yeah, this is a good, nice comprehensive plan. And they note there is no pre-kindergarten this year. That's their solution. Yeah. There is face mask wearing, but there is no testing plan. Right? That's a big problem because I don't think you can open without testing. But otherwise, if you want to get an idea of the kinds of things that people are doing, it's comprehensive in other areas. But in my view, without testing, I don't see how you can open unless you're in an area where there have never been any cases. Right.
Right. Yeah. I think the one thing as I look through this, that I don't totally see is information related to what types of transmission or how many cases are seen in the community, but I might be just missing that as I'm looking at it.
Yeah. I think any program has to have testing. Either it's pooled or rapid tests, you have to figure it out. And I understand paying for it is an issue, but you have to consider if it's preschool to have the parents chip in because they're the ones who are going to benefit, right?
Another thing that may be going unsaid here in all of these kinds of plans is what are you going to do? At what level are you going to say this is too many cases, too many kids are positive in the school, too many teachers, whatever, how are we going to act? At least to have thought about it. And, everybody was winging it in March this year. And you would hope that at least going forward, people will think about it more and think about the levels at which different kinds of actions will be triggered.
Yep.
Right. I completely agree. I think that having those plans in place and being clear about what's going to happen and not making people kind of evacuate the classroom is important.
I mean, these are tough issues because depending on how small your district is, you may not have anyone with the expertise to answer these questions and put these plans in place. And you may have to move, to a health district somewhere higher than you, right? You need to seek out that help because you can't just depend on the local family doctor to come up with plans. They may not really know what the issues are.
Right. So in that case, Illinois public health would be important.
Hopefully they would be able to shed some light. We would hope at the state level, there's some.
To your point, Kathy, as I've mentioned before, the Austin Public Health does have a staging thing where, depending on what the 7-day moving average of hospital admissions is, you are in a different stage of precautions that need to be taken. Okay, so at least if people are tuned into this, they can look at it. I kind of track it and figure, am I yellow today or red or orange or whatever. I don't think that currently in the Austin one that the staging includes recommendations for whether or not schools should be open. But given the thought that they seem to be putting into this, I would imagine that ultimately maybe that'll be part of it.
You hope so.
I hope so.
All right. And Anonymous writes, Dear TWiV, every day I look forward to listening to your latest podcast. I live in Southern California. For the past 20 years, I've worked as a hairstylist in a salon frequented by the rich and famous. I've always had an interest in science and factual information, although I have no real higher education. I come into contact with hundreds of people and have developed close client relationship. I listen to as much science news and podcasts as I can, read books, pass on interesting tidbits and conversations. You'd be surprised how many seemingly normal, monetarily successful, and supposedly highly educated people plan their lives according to whether or not Mercury is in retrograde.
I would say that she has fabricated her own higher education. Good for you.
Some even plan haircuts according to the waxing or waning of the moon. A lot of them are anti-vaxxers. I haven't worked in the salon since March 14th and mostly stay indoors. I miss my clients, but luckily I'm an artist, spent my time drawing and sewing, listening to your podcasts. I've had to look up many things. I'm learning so much. I've done the occasional house call, and even that limited interaction with the public has brought into sharp focus the lack of understanding of science. No one knows what a journal is, or what a preprint paper is, or what it means to be published. No one knows how science works, or how to get information from a reliable source. I find that most people get their information from headlines and other people. And as science progresses, people think they're changing their minds and that everyone says something different. And the most frustrating and common one, we all have our opinion, and it's up to people to decide which side to believe. I think this gets to the root of the problem in our country. Average people don't know how to find sources and don't know how science works. Average people are confused and have given up. Average people have decided to just live their lives. I have a unique perspective, having contact with thousands of people, with an hour's worth of conversation with 8 to 10 different people a day. Very few of my clients know how science and research is done. Most of them are superstitious, and a lot of them repeat conspiracy theories as plausible fact. Most of them went to reputable universities. Obviously, they didn't major in science. And now, because it seems people have given up, I feel that going back to work in a salon is a high risk of infection. For example, an assistant tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 and came back after a week, and when a coworker complained, she was sent home for another week. The salon never closed. No one was told they were in the salon on the days she worked. No one was told to get tested. She wasn't required to get a negative test. I'm sure it wasn't laziness or negligence, but rather a lack of understanding. It's unbelievable to me that most people have little or no understanding of basic science when I am able to understand, and I'm a hairstylist. People don't
Just
know.
a hairstylist.
Yeah, just.
Right?
I forgot the just.
They don't say just, but yeah.
People don't know who to listen to or where to get their information. Unfortunately, the politicians are loud and the scientists are busy. Thank you for your podcast. I've forwarded it to many people, but no one has the patience to try to understand what the heck you're talking about. You can discuss more. Can you discuss more about the link between blood type and COVID-19? Anyway, this is a great letter, and you
That's
hit
a
a
great
lot
letter.
of very key things. I noticed yesterday the MMWR, that's Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. This is a publication of the CDC where they report on outbreaks. It's free, and it's really nicely written. Everybody could understand it. They have a story about a hairdresser who 139 people were treated. Everyone wore masks and nobody got infected. It's a great story. So you can do it
Even
safely.
though the hairdresser was two hairdressers
was
that were
positive.
Yeah.
Yes.
In fact, my hairdresser said it was part of that made her feel confident about going back to work.
This mask thing is a big deal, you
Yeah.
know?
It
They made
is
very clear the importance of masks.
Yeah.
It is a big deal. And people say all the time, I want to have a right to wear masks. You can't. You cannot have the right to kill someone else. That's what it comes down to. So you have to suspend this idea that you have a right not to wear a mask. You do not.
Well, I just come back to the leadership issue. A good leadership at the federal level would make such a difference in all of this, but it's not there right now. I'd like to know from Anonymous. I wish Anonymous could speak to everybody. I wish there was a way that we could teach people the stuff she wants to teach. How do you do this?
Yeah.
Well, we're trying here, right? But they don't
Yeah.
want to listen. It's
Well,
2 hours, it's too long, and it's too hard.
Yeah, you have to think.
You have to think. And if you're not willing, and the thing is, they went to college. I'm not surprised. A lot of college education doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't teach you critical thinking. And people seem to have discarded the idea of reading, right? And just absorbing things, mostly listening and watching. But reading really goes a long way.
And kind of learning broadly across a few different areas and understanding what's going on in things that aren't, even if you're not a scientist, having an idea of what goes on in science.
Now,
I need to learn some hairstyling.
I don't want you to think we're coming off as being arrogant in any way. I'm just saying that there's a lot of information out there, and you can figure it out if you just put in the effort. All right, I understand. So anyway, that was great. Thank you, Anonymous. And as far
Anonymous, please come do my hair.
Well, she's in California, right? Yeah, Southern California. Blood type and COVID-19, we will. I don't think there's enough information on it yet, okay? There seems to be an association with blood type and milder infection, but I want to wait till there's some peer-reviewed work out there, and then we'll do it, I promise.
Yeah, it's not clear if it's the blood type or other genetic factors that are sort of associated with blood type.
Rich, can you take the next one?
Imans writes, I only recently began listening to your podcast, and I thank you for what you do. Some of the frustrations that you expressed in episode 637, along with your brief reference to Winston Churchill, brought to mind a quote that has been at least apocryphally attributed to Winston Churchill. I wanted to share this quote with you here because I feel like it's as relevant as ever. Quote, "You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." End quote. Okay, keep up the good work. Cheers. That's very good.
Well, anyway, there's a lot of content in this episode for all of you. Ton.
Yeah.
640 microbe.tv/TWiV is where you can find the show notes. Questions and comments, TWiV@microbe.tv. If you like what we do, we'd appreciate your financial support. You can go to microbe.tv/contribute. Brianne Barker is at Drew University. She is BioProf Barker on Twitter. Thank you, Brianne.
Thanks. It was great to be here. I learned so much from Michael. I want to be sharing this episode with everyone.
Important stuff, really. Rich Condit is an emeritus professor, University of Florida, Gainesville, currently residing in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Rich.
Sure enough, it's a privilege.
Kathy Spindler's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. I'm going to sneak in something. We're not getting to do picks of the week, but today's astronomy picture of the day is a really cool sort of multiple image of comet Neowise. We haven't even gotten to talk about this new comet.
Oh, wow. Yeah, my wife's been talking about this comet for a while. Whoa.
And this APOD, astronomy picture of the day, is just gorgeous.
I see it. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So there you go. Thanks.
Awesome.
It's good.
Maybe we should start doing picks again.
Yeah. I have a whole lot queued up.
Because that raises, it gives a little lightness to the episodes, which are great.
Yeah.
Well, and it's, they're supposed to be science picks of the week,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe we'll
occasionally
start
something
Friday.
like,
And this comet is worth paying attention to.
yeah.
And you only get this chance. It's every 6,000 years.
Yeah.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.blog. I'd like to thank the American Society for Virology and the American Society for Microbiology for their support of TWiV, and Ronald Jenkins for the music. This episode of TWiV was recorded, edited, and posted by me, Vincent Racaniello. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.